Hello and welcome to this, the very final match of GP Sydney. On the left of our screen, that's Jan Casander of the Czech Republic. His very first Pro Tour will be next weekend at Pro Tour Eldritch Moon. On the other side of things, Scott Lipp, who finished top of the Swiss in this tournament, and both these players, quite different decks, Frank Karsten, and they are now ready to play for the trophy here in Australia.
Yes, indeed. This will be a matchup between Scott Lipp's super aggressive white-green deck, who's starting off with a fine 2-drop in Noose Constrictor, semi-wild mongrel reincarnation, now complete with Reach. Jan Casander playing a bit of a more controlling deck with lots of heavy-hitting mythics for the late game. What he is looking to set up is, well, either an Emrakul, the Promised End, in the very late game, or perhaps a Tamiyo Field Researcher as a nice planeswalker. But he will be on the defensive early on. If the game goes long, Jan is favored, but Scott Lips is set up to play creatures early on, pump them, and hopefully finish off the game in short order. So far, Scott has hit his curve after a mulligan with Noose Constrictor and Bloodbriar, so things are going as planned for Scott Lips so far.
Thraben Gargoyle, the only play for Jan Casander thus far, elected not to, well, force a discard probably from Scott Lipp early on, rather than even getting the trade by blocking the Noose Constrictor. Just passing things back here. I mean, his control deck, not as replete with creatures. He's making up for it by having a little bit in the way of removal and sort of spells to work with. But right now, kind of taking things a little easy, that is, of course, going to cost him a little bit in terms of life.
Looks like there are no blocks for Jan Casander, who is struggling a bit to find his footing in this game. Hasn't produced a relevant blocker yet, not for the Noose Constrictor and the Bloodbriar. And now there's also a Backwoods Survivalist entering the battlefield. Just a 4-3. Hey, it becomes bigger when you have Delirium, but Scott Lipp is typically trying to have locked up the game before he even comes close to Delirium. Although, thanks to 2 copies of Lunarch Mantle in his deck, he is able to achieve Delirium in the mid to late game if it comes to that.
Yeah, I mean, even here, just as the 4-3, it's pretty good. Does gain trample as well when Delirium is active, but right now it's simply the biggest body on the board, and that's going to be enough to make Jan Casander have pause here. Just the Thraben Gargoyle for him thus far. And you can see him there just checking out his hand. I mean, the one thing that you do have when you've not played very many spells is plenty of cards to look at in your hand. And Gavony Unhallowed there as a 2-4 actually is a pretty reasonable blocker in this state, and now there might be more of an inclination for him to trade that Thraben Gargoyle for something, because when it dies, on top of getting 2 card types in the graveyard, he's going to get a +1/+1 counter on that zombie.
Now Scott will still be able to attack with pretty much all of his creatures. The worst that may happen is, say that, well, Jan, for example, double blocks the 4-3 Survivalist with both of his creatures. That's not too bad for Scott. Alternatively, Jan could block the Noose Constrictor with Gavony Unhallowed. That will force a double discard from Scott, which is not great. If Scott is not willing to offer up the double discard, attacking with the Bloodbriar is also not going to achieve all that much, because Jan can just block it with Gavony Unhallowed. So just an attack with the Backwoods Survivalist today.
So Jan Casander dropping to 10 life here and having to just look on as Scott Lipp goes searching for a human on the top of his deck here.
And that's a Courageous Outrider. Well, misses.
And it's still a 3-4 for 4, so it's not as if Scott Lipp here has played a particularly embarrassing creature, even in spite of not getting to draw a card.
Well, there's a Plains for Jan Casander, so he actually has access to mana for Tamiyo, in case he would find one. But so far what Jan needs to do in order to claw back into this game is to put down a big blocker.
5 mana. And the young player from the Czech Republic has a pretty good one in terms of putting down blockers and indeed dealing with what's coming from the other side of things. That a Dark Salvation to make 2 zombies. In total, 3 zombies in play. That means -3/-3 for the big 4-3 on Scott Lipp's side of the board. Killing a creature, making a couple of blockers. This is how Jan Casander's getting back in this game.
Yeah, this is an excellent way to get there. All of those creatures he gained will also be able to, well, after they trade, grow that Gavony Unhallowed, So that is the perfect card for the situation. Dark Salvation, one of the better rares in Eldritch Moon. First pick, first pack, I think you just take this over any common or uncommon. Look here, it provided 4 power, 4 toughness, and dealt with a 4/3 on the other side of the board. That's an amazing deal for 5 mana.
Yeah, and now Scott Lipp kind of just having to regroup a little bit, figure out what he's going to do. Plays a Woodland Patrol. That not necessarily going to do too much in the short term, but extra bodies on the board never going to hurt.
Yeah, and eventually Scott may be able to start attacking with all of his creatures, threaten some kind of pump spell. There is a nice card in Eldritch Moon, Borrowed Grace, that can give all creatures +2/+2 for 5 mana. However, looking at Scott Lipp's deck list, looks like he didn't pick up any of them. Only pump spells that target a single creature.
Yeah, but something like Woodcutter's Grit could potentially punish almost any kind of blocking that's going on for Jan Cassander. Giving Hexproof and +3/+3 is a big deal. Stitchwing Scab the play, though, for Cassander, and unfortunately for him, he's facing down that Constrictor on the other side of the board, which does have reach.
Well, Jan is perfectly content to just sit back for now and defend. If Scott Lipp would eventually down the road trade his Noose Constrictor for the Stitchwing Scab, it can just come back from the graveyard. Oh, and it would also put a counter on the Gavony Unhallowed, so that's not too bad. Aha, so this will Intrepid Provisioner. That'll turn the Courageous Outrider into a 5/6. And now Jan Cassander will have a tough decision to make. He could just take the damage because the boost is only temporarily for this turn, but then he would fall down to 5 life. That is kind of dangerous. Alternatively, well, he could just jump block it, I guess, but that's not going to be that smart of a decision because the Intrepid Provisioner also gives trample.
There is a Tamiyo in Jan Cassander's
or never mind,
hand.
the Intrepid Provisioner has trample by itself. It doesn't actually give trample. Alternatively, Jan can just line up a triple block, say with a zombie, and a Traben Gargoyle, thereby taking down the Courageous Outrider and putting a lot of counters on the Gavony Unhallowed. Goes just for the jump block with the Stitchwing Scab that can come back from the graveyard. Fair enough. Protecting his life total in a situation like this makes a lot of sense.
So Tamiyo is in Jan Cassander's hand. That an option available to him. He does have the mana to cast her. You could potentially play her -2 to tap a couple of non-land permanents, in this case creatures, because that's pretty much all Scott Lipp has beyond his lands. And they wouldn't untap during the next untap step, so he could kind of offer himself a little bit of time that way. Alternatively, I think there are a few other cards in Jan Cassander's hand as he builds up his mana base, all those options coming available to him.
Yeah, as the game progresses, that Gavony Unhallowed may get out of hand, and Scott Lipp doesn't really have many good ways in his deck to deal with it. I don't see a choking restraints in his deck list. He has 2 copies of Prey Upon, but that's a damage-based removal spell, which is not going to help much against a high toughness blocker. So currently already the Gavony Unhallowed 3/5 can profitably block all of Scott Lipp's creatures, and there's a Tooth Collector added to the battlefield.
Yeah, not able to actually kill anything off right here, but at least in principle, if it works out that Delirium comes along, it will be able to provide a consistent source of shrinking of creatures. And Scott Lipp will have some things in his deck that are going to really feel it when they lose a point of power and indeed toughness for a turn.
So now Scott Lipp has Confront the Unknown in his hand. That is the green combat trick that would give, well, +1/+1 to a creature. Not really the big boost that he needs to break through. Even his biggest 3-power creature with that +1/+1 boost cannot attack into the Gavony Unhallowed. So Scott unfortunately just has to sit back and pass the turn as Jan Cassander discards Emrakul. Maybe this Rise from the Tides play that you mentioned earlier, we might be seeing that.
A Rise from the Grave here would be absolutely colossal. It would be just a dream come true, a nightmare come true for someone. Stitchwing Scab, in the meanwhile, is just a perfectly serviceable creature that can actually prove relevant on this board, getting stuck in. There are no flyers for Scott Lipp. All he has going on, if he wants to block, is Noose Constrictor, and it looks like he elects not to here. Post-combat. Here we have it.
Yes!
Rise from the grave. Emrakul in play. 13-13 flying trample. Protection from instant. So it's not to say that Skotlip has zero opportunity to deal with Emrakul, but Emrakul in play, certainly a problem for pretty much any deck in pretty much any format.
Flying, trample. Yeah, looking at Skotlip's deck list, I don't see a way out of this. Not here. There's a a lone rider. Well, it's just a very lone creature in the face of this monstrous Emrakul. Awesome to see it in the finals of this GP here. Beautiful to see the combination between just some discard effects and that Rise from the Grave. Wow. 13-13, trample, flying. I don't think Skotlip will be able to beat this one.
I think Liliana would approve of doing this with Emrakul once you've dealt with Emrakul. Additionally, Emrakul is now a black zombie.
Wow, the irony. Yeah, I'm not sure what Liliana would say of that indeed, but one way or another, Jan is ahead in the tentacle game.
And here's Tamiyo.
Because why not?
Insult, injury, I have all of these things. Please enjoy them.
This is like a story element game where all of the main players from the Eldritch Moon story come out on the battlefield to have their say.
Flavor-wise, I'm not convinced that this way that they play out is quite the way that they go in the story section on the Magic the Gathering website. You might have to just read up on that one to make sure.
No, for that I think Scott has to play an island and then imprisoned in the moon, but I don't think that's going to happen.
So Skotlip untaps here. What's he going to do about all this gas? Well, he's going to scoop up his cards and say, on to game 2. Jan Kassander turning things around there in basically the most exciting possible way.
Yeah.
I'm going to call it right now. Rise from the Grave on Emrakul.
Just
What more
awesome.
could we ask for?
I mean, I could ask for the Mindslaver trigger, but yeah, you don't get that one when you don't actually cast Emrakul. Then again, even without that, well, there's not much that could have gone better for Jan Kassander. It looked like he was super far behind early on, as Skotlip hit his curve, had creatures on turn 2, on turn 3, on turn 4. Jan had only just a 2/2, the Traben Gargoyle on the battlefield. Wasn't able to line up any blocks. I thought Skotlip was definitely going to take that game early on, but well, first the Dark Salvation, which was a huge swing, providing both the removal spell and a lot of power on the battlefield so that Jan could line up some blocks. And that allowed him to stabilize for long enough to set up that awesome combination. You see the smile on his face. He's happy, not just because he, is in the finals of a GP, one game up, but also because the cards he put in his deck, probably with this idea in the back of his mind, like, hey, maybe I'll reanimate Emrakul. It's all coming together beautifully.
Achievement unlocked.
Oh yes.
Yeah, it's not very often that you see a blue-black deck with Tamiyo in play. It's not very often that you see any deck with Emrakul in play. Very happy to see Jan Kassander achieving both of those things in the final of this GP. And potentially, he could do it again. We've got one more game at least in this finals. Jan Kassander, of course, will be very happy if it does work out. There's only one more game because that would mean that he's the victor. Skotlip, he's going to have to win 2 on the bounce if he's going to take the trophy. These players both looking at their sideboards, and it looks like Jan Kassander got some fairly substantial sideboarding going on here. I mean, one thing when you have a couple of copies of Terrarion in your deck is that there are more options, even the things like the Prey Upon that didn't make his main deck that's a little bit tricky to cast in game 1. Well, he could look into that potentially. He's got all sorts of options, and he's certainly going to make sure that all of them are considered.
Meanwhile, I've been looking at Skotlip's deck list, also at his sideboard, to check out if there's any answer to an early Emrakul. I don't see anything really. So Skotlip will just have to go for his original game plan of presenting a fast clock, playing some pump spells, and hoping that it works out at least before that big bad Emrakul comes down. Now, in the meantime, Jan Kassander may be interested in boarding in some early creatures. If he has some left in his sideboard. Don't really see many. Perhaps Enlightened Maniac just as a jump blocker and something to trade, because he needs all the defense he can get against the powerful aggro deck from Skotlip.
I'm sad to say that Scott Lipp doesn't have the ultimate in flavor fail enchantments to deal with Emrakul in choking restraint. I can't quite imagine how you would choke out Emrakul. It's not something that Scott Lipp's going to have available to him, though. Those things tend to get snapped up pretty early in drafts, and even though Scott's in white, he does not have any of them available to him in his 40 or indeed in his sideboard, though frankly that's not one that you tend to see in many sideboards. Scott Lipp taking a mulligan here.
Once again, you also had to go down to 6 in the first game. Well, that's just the danger of building an aggressive deck. You don't always have a good curve early on, and then you're just forced to take a mulligan. Then again, it's also excellent card selection in search of a fast draw. Meanwhile, looks like Jan Xander is happy with his 7-card opening hand. He cannot hide his excitement. See that smile on Jan Xander's face.
I think I'd feel the same way. I think I'd have a big silly grin on my face for the entirety of the final. I would be sad that Scott Lipp was the one that picked up Tamio's journal during this draft rather than me, because I wanted to put together the most crazy sort of flavor sandwich that you're ever going to be able to put together.
Yeah, flavor points don't really count for winning a GP, but it's a nice bonus, that's for sure. Especially in this first weekend where we get to see Eldritch Moon cards in action. It's out on Magic Online now, so it's an awesome format. Hall of Famer Ben Stark has called it in the best draft formats he's had over the course of the last 5 years. So join in on the fun. Maybe you'll open Emrakul as well.
All right, so just an equipment on turn 2 for Scott Lipp, but it will mean that each of his creatures are a little bit more threatening. Not the fastest. It takes a full 3 to equip for the +2/+2 on that cultist staff. Have we got a creature on turn 3? It's looking like we haven't, and that potentially opening the door for Jan Xander to be a bit freer about sort of just gradually building his board without worrying his life, and has a Skirsdag Supplicant there.
And still a creature came down, Drugskool Shieldmate, 2/3 flash. It's at least a creature on turn 3 that may carry an equipment, and with that equipment it would turn into a 4/5, which can attack into the Skirsdag Supplicant.
Kind of like playing the flash creature at end of turn there. It just means that there was less opportunity for Jan Xander to kill it off. It did give other creatures, well, if Scott Lipp had any, they would have got +1 toughness. A 2/3 for 3 though, with flash, pretty solid just even as the first creature you play on the game.
Well, looks like Scott Lipp wants to use his mana for something else this turn. So he's just attacking with the Shieldman. Now he has some pump spells in his deck that he could use in case Jan decides to block. On the other hand, well, if you're Jan, you may be thinking, well, what's the worst that can happen? If I block, then Scott will have to spend his pump spell, which means that Scott may not have mana available to add a creature to the board. And in addition to that, well, if Scott uses his pump spell, then he cannot use it later on in the game. Still, Jan does read Scott for some kind of trick and just takes the damage. Note that Scott would have 2 copies of, say, Strength of Arms in his deck, so that might have allowed him to set up well, a good tempo play with a pump spell. Same deal with Confront the Unknown. Perhaps Jan did not want to offer that.
Well, as it turns out, the follow-up play was a Bloodbriar, so it wasn't as if Scott had nothing to do with his mana. Meanwhile, Jan Xander does just pass things back here, and another attack coming from Scott Lipp. This time looks like it will prompt a block from the young Czech player.
Yeah, and this time Jan Xander has 4 mana up, so all kinds of tricks could come out over here, even with Madness.
So Strength of Arms on the Bloodbriar there. We can see it there whenever another permanent is sacrificed, put a +1/+1 counter on Bloodbriar.
Well, this is the card that Jan was probably afraid of on the previous turn. That said, it is a little bit risky for Scott Lipp to be playing this card in the face of all this open mana, because there are plenty of cards that Jan could have to punish him for that. Well, this is a borrowed Malevolence, so that's going to turn his Skirsdag Supplicant into a 3/4 and turn the Bloodbriar into, well, also a 3/4, so that the 2 creatures effectively bounce.
So he's sort of countered Strength of Arms, but the fact that there's a human been created by it as well means that it's not quite the full impact that he was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
with Escalate, costing a full 3 mana to give +1/+1 and -1/-1 there. We see Borrowed Malevolence. And the follow-up play for Scott Lip here, kind of an interesting one.
Lupine Prototype. Well, it's not going to do anything yet, but once any player gets to Hellbent, that is no cards in hand, it can start attacking. Currently Scott Lip still has 2 cards in hand, and he's a bit constrained on mana given that he has only found 3 lands so far. So that means that that Lupine Prototype is probably not going to become relevant for the next couple of turns or so. That said, it could prove to be a potent attacker down the road.
Stitchwing Scarb, MVP from last game, as the point man setting up with the assist to get Emrakul into play. We will see whether or not that's going to happen for a second game in a row. In the meantime, of course, just a solid 3/1 flyer.
Yep. So now Scott Lip, on the one hand, he may want to equip one of his creatures so that it can start attacking into the 3 toughness Curse Deck Supplicant. On the other hand, he may want to spend his mana to empty his hand in order to turn on that Lupine Prototype. Note that at worst, Scott Lip could just attack with, say, Bloodbriar and Drogskol Shieldmate, and then Jon Kassander will either, well, leave one of the 2 creatures unblocked, or trade it for the Stitchwing Scarab. Both of the situations seem reasonably fine for Scott Lip. Well, unless he is once again scared of Stitchwing Scarab dying, then discarding Emrakul, and being returned with Rise from the Grave. That game 1 will probably still be fresh in his mind at this point.
I mean, I'm not sure there's too much he can do about that. He's just going to have to hope that he's got what he needs to be able to finish this game good and quick. The longer this game goes on, the more likely those sorts of scenarios become of simply being true.
Scott Lip having a good think about this particular situation. As I mentioned, he could just equip, say, his Drogskol Shieldmate with the Cultist Staff, attack with it, and then, well, Jon Kassander either has to double block in an unfavorable trade or take 4 damage. But then again, playing the cards from your hand to turn on the Lupine Prototype in, perhaps the next turn is quite valuable as well. Looks like he's upgrading his 1/1 human into a 3/2 Eldrazi with Extricator of Sin. Not too bad, also putting a counter on Bloodbriar in the process.
Yeah, I like this. Extricator of Sin, a solid one to have in play, and already an instant in the graveyard, potentially some creatures ending up in there sometime fairly soon. If he does get to Delirium, then the Extricator of Sin has the potential to get even better. In the meantime, the Bloodbriar getting a +1/+1 counter, kind of big, meaning that it can attack in a little bit more easily. And here it looks like it's going to be taking down a Skizdark Supplicant, but in the meantime, Extricator of Flesh, there we can see it. If the Extricator of Sin transforms, well, all the Eldrazi tokens in play get a bit better with Vigilance, and as does the Extricator itself, and you can start sacrificing non-Eldrazi's to put more Eldrazi into play.
Still, for it to transform, Scott Lip needs to hit Delirium. Currently only instant and creature in his graveyard, so he's still a long way off. That said, Scott Lip is ahead this game. Way ahead on the battlefield, just by the number of creatures, power and toughness of his creatures, as well as a Cultist Staff that can provide quite a boost over the course of a long game. Jon Kassander, only a 3/1 flyer on the battlefield. Sure, it can start attacking, but Jan is already behind on the damage race. His game plan in this matchup will, well, be to defend early on and then hope to win in the late game with his more powerful cards. Stitchwing Scarab, not really the best at defending.
Yeah, I mean, Jan Kassander's deck, once it gets to the late game, does have some very powerful cards. We saw the first turning point in game 1 was the casting of Dark Salvation to make a couple of zombies and kill a creature. Just the kind of going big plays that Jan Kassander needs to stabilize, and then, you know, when he wins, he can win very big indeed.
Not this time around. He had to pass the turn with 6 mana up. And there's a Lunarch Mantle.
Lunarch Mantle and then a Prey Upon, not just dealing with the one creature on Jan Kassander's side of the board, but also emptying Scott Lip's hand, that meaning that the attacks that come through here are going to be fairly special.
And the Lupine Prototype is getting in here. This is a lot of damage. Attack for 12 with Jan Kassander at 14 life. Kaboom. Well, better find something to do with this Jan, otherwise you are unlikely to survive the next combat step, even with a reanimated Emrakul. A 13-13 may be big, but if there's just too many creatures coming your way, even an Emrakul can be overwhelmed.
So Cassandra just weighing up the opportunity to get back his Stitchwing Scab here.
Yeah, the Lupine prototype is overperforming for Scotlip in this top 8. It's a type of card that doesn't fit in any deck. Only put it in if you have a relatively low curve, not if you have all kinds of 6 or 7 drops that can get stuck in your hand. But in a deck like Scotlip's with a low curve, well, now he has Hellbent. It also works well as a creature for his Prey Upon, so it works well in his deck.
Yeah, liking that one. And Jan Cassander here, he's in one of those sort of puzzling challenges. He had to discard Tamiyo there to his Stitchwing Scab. Basically, didn't have the mana to cast her, and as it turns out, doesn't have the spells to cast to stay in this game. He scoops up his cards. This GP will come down to one final game. That one final game will be one where Jan Cassander's going first, if he chooses so, and it will be for the trophy.
Yep, these games have been quite telling so far. If Scotlip is able to hit his curve, then use cards like Prey Upon effectively. Looks like he has the edge so far. But if Jan Xander finds some of his powerful rares or mythics, then Jan Xander has the edge. And in this particular game, Jan had none of them. No Dark Salvation. We didn't get to see Tamiyo. No Emrakul. Yeah, his deck is not as good when he doesn't find any of those cards. And likewise, when Jan Xander doesn't have excellent early game blockers, he's also far behind against the quite aggressive deck from Scotlip here. Looking at Jan Xander's deck list, he doesn't even have all that many early game blockers. There's a Wailing Ghoul, a 1/3 for 2 mana, Scourge Deck Supplicant, 2/3 for 3 mana, a bunch of late game and expensive cards. And, well, Pale Rider of Trostad. If he finds that one on turn 2, that could prove to be quite a good blocker early on. But he will need some of these cards, I think, in order to keep up with Jan Xander's deck.
So a little bit more sideboarding going on for Jan Cassander. He checked out a couple of little bits and pieces with the judges just in between games. Just wanted to make sure that he knew what was what there so that he made everything just as neat and clean as it can be in this final. It looks like he's fetching up a few additional lands. That's what he's requesting from the judges. Adjusting his mana base in this final. I mean, his mana base has every potential to be quite complicated. And actually, there are quite a few good cards in green in Jan Xander's sideboard that he might be working with.
It may not even be an adjustment of his mana base. It may also be an increase in his mana base. When you are going to be on the play, it can be nice to have one extra land, especially when you have a deck filled with powerful, expensive cards. Because when you're on the play, you have one fewer draw step to assemble your mana base. So I've always been happy to board in a land, going up from 17 to 18 when I'm on the play. And this may also be a strategy that Jan Xander is implementing here right now, because he will definitely need to hit his land drops. Scotlip's deck is not going to give him any amount of time to stumble.
It's interesting. I mean, that's an idea that I actually hadn't really considered before in terms of sideboarding. Specifically in Limited, obviously in Constructed, your sideboard is the 15 cards that you have brought with you specifically for that purpose. So any lands that you want to bring in have to be there. But in Draft, in Sealed Deck, any of the cards that you've opened, they are your sideboard. But additionally, any number of the regular 5 basics are available to you too. Wastes, of course, you do need to have them in your pool or draft them to be able to put them in.
As many as you want. Hey, you can even board up to a 5,000 card deck if you want.
Best of luck shuffling it though.
Yeah, that's a problem. Though it is a strategy that sometimes comes up against a deck that tries to mill you out. That's not really a strategy that we see in Eldritch Moon Limited, but it has happened over the course of the game. As for strategies in this format in general, we've seen all kinds of nice color combinations and synergies doing work, ranging from the red-white Spells Matter deck with Thermo Alchemist, Ingenious Scab, getting all kinds of bonuses from just playing spells. We've seen the green-black Delirium decks, something like a Traben Foulblood, a creature that gets a boost when you have Delirium, as well as a Grapple with the Past. But in the end here, it's blue-black versus green-white. Not so much decks really focused around synergies all that much, just solid cards, and that is still perfectly fine, as evidenced by the finals appearance of these two players.
You can see a little smile on Yank-Sander's face there. Not disheartened by having lost the second game here. He knows he's still got one shot left at lifting the trophy and shuffling up in the hope that he's going to be able to make the most of those little changes that he's made to his deck and pull it out here in this, what will be the very last game of GP Sydney. For those of you that are enjoying Eldritch Moon Limited, I mean, there's going to be more Magic going on this weekend. I mean, the GP that's going on here, there are GPs going on in both Stockholm in Sweden and in Montreal, Canada. They'll be covered on the text side of our website if you want to find out what's going on there. And of course, tune back in on Friday as the Pro Tour starts here in Sydney. And in fact, if you're in the US, effectively it'll be Thursday night that the Pro Tour starts in Sydney.
Yeah, time zones are a tricky thing.
Oh, yeah, tell that to my body right now. It has absolutely no idea what time it is.
Oh yeah, and for many of the pros who flew all the way over here to Sydney, many of them have been fighting through jet lag in order to get through these 2 days of competition. But the final game, jet lag or no, is getting underway.
Well, we didn't see any mulligans, which is a great start. Scott Lipp, though, was able to put up a good showing in both games in spite of mulligans for games 1 and 2.
Nagging thoughts. I would just love to see Emrakul being put into the graveyard here, ready for Rise from the Grave, but just a swamp, as Yank-Sander, I believe, picked up a swamp for his hand. Lone Rider. Well, this is the 1/1 lifelink that whenever you gain 3 life over the course of 1 turn, it'll transform into it that rides as 1. I love these names, which would be quite a menacing 4/4 trample lifelink first strike, but Scott Lipp will have to gain 3 life, or actually keep his creature around in the first place.
Yeah, Boon of Emrakul, that's the first time we've seen it in this match. Dealing with it that rides as 1, or I guess Lone Rider at the point that he used it on it.
Emrakul team deck confirmed.
Crow of Dark Tidings putting more cards into the graveyard. We now have enchantment, instant, land, and creature in the graveyard. So Delirium active, and as far as Emrakul's concerned, Delirium's only in the beginning. As many card types as you want to get in the graveyard will all reduce the cost of Emrakul, the Promised End.
Yeah, would cost 9 mana as it stands right now. So there's a Courageous Outrider. Is there a human in the top 4 of Scott Lipp's library?
It looks like there might be. He's just having a little look and a think, which signals that possibly there's more than one. He's trying to choose the best one for the situation.
So far, Scott Lipp is getting ahead in this game. He hit his curve of a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop. Yank-Sander was forced to use a 3-mana removal spell to deal with a 2-mana creature, so Yank-Sander missed basically a mana on the exchange. And now the Crow of Dark Tidings that Jan has put on the battlefield, it's pretty much irrelevant against the high toughness creatures from Scott Lipp.
So Scott ultimately chose Extricator of Sin there as the creature to put into his hand off that effect. So he's now passed the turn back.
Jan can now try to enter a damage race by attacking with his Crow of Dark Tidings, but his deck is not really set up to be winning any damage races. Typically, Jan would be trying to defend early on and then win the late game with more powerful cards. And, well, when it comes to damage races, the board is not looking all that favorable for Yank-Sander here yet, but let's see what he adds. Terrarion, also not really the card he needs to stabilize. There will be 5 power coming his way on the next attack.
Yeah, Terrarion very much a sort of long game card. It doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play. Yes, it represents an artifact in the graveyard, which will be great in terms of getting that Emrakul cheaper. Yes, it represents mana fixing, which is great in terms of casting Tamiyo, but the turn you play it, well, effectively you've just invested some time in getting it into play for future turns. When you sacrifice it, you do get to draw a card. But there's the Extricator of Sin that Scott Lipp revealed last turn, and sacrificing a forest, making a Eldrazi horror token, and there is the Lupin prototype. gradually getting rid of cards in hand. Scotlip, though, it's going to take him a little bit more if he's going to be attacking with that 5/5 anytime soon.
That said, he is emptying his hand quite rapidly. Wouldn't be surprised to see an attack by the Lupine prototype in, say, 2 turns. That is at least something that Jan Xander has to worry about right now, but it's not the only thing that Jan has to be worried about. There's a lot of power coming his way. Jan really needs to put down some defenses, because that Crow of Dark Titans by itself, it's not going to win a damage race, not even close. It will likely stay behind as a fine blocker for the 3/2 Eldrazi token, but Jan still needs to add some additional defenses if he wants to stay in this game. He may have to think about what's in his deck before sacrificing Terrarion. Also, perhaps if he sacrifices it now and then draws Tamiyo later in the game, he may not have the mana to cast it. So, plenty of options that he has to think about before committing to a play.
Yeah, we don't know quite how much white mana he has access to after sideboarding, because we know that he was adjusting his mana base just a little bit.
Well, Dark Salvation would still be quite good here, the card that he had in the first game. But given that he didn't play it on turn 5, I don't expect him to be having it here. Emrakul, well, after the Terrarion, it would cost 8 mana, so still a little bit off. Getting close, but Scotlip is not going to give Jan Xander a lot of time in order to put down Emrakul on the battlefield.
So, Xander does crack the Terrarion. Draws a card.
Keeping his cards close to his chest, not letting anyone get a peek at him. And Jan has been really praised by his Czech compatriots so far for his playing skill. Hasn't been playing for a long time, but is bursting on the scene with an excellent finish. And there is Tamiyo. Alright, Planeswalker is down, but it will only provide a temporary measure, as sure he can lock down those 2 attackers, then still have Crow of Dark Tidings to block the Eldrazi token. But so far, it doesn't really gain him any permanent advantage.
Yeah, Tamiyo, the +1 ability to give curiosity to a couple of creatures, certainly powerful, but kind of you need the luxury of being a little bit ahead there. The middle ability, sometimes it's also powerful when you're ahead. It can be, as we've seen here, pretty reasonable when you're behind also, just buying you a little bit of time to get out of a situation. But Jan Xander doesn't have all that much time, even in spite of Tamiyo. He really does need to draw into something good very quickly, though. I guess that if Tamiyo goes to the graveyard, that is another card type for Emrakul.
Alright, getting closer, getting closer. That is, we could actually, could we see Emrakul on the next turn? There are now 5 different card types in the graveyard. If the Planeswalker also gets there, and Jan Xander has a land and Emrakul in hand, that's still a lot of different things that have to go right. Well, it is possible. So Lunarch Mantle on the Eldrazi token. If Jan wants to protect either his life total or Tamiyo, he will have to chump block it. Also the Extricator of Sin is getting in, possibly signifying a pump spell.
Yep, there it is. No equipment in play this time, so it's just a straightforward +2/+2, but I say just +2/+2 will do it.
Yeah, assuming that the Extricator of Sin was attacking Tamiyo, that will take down the Planeswalker.
2 cards going to the graveyard when Crow of Dark Tiding dies.
Yeah, Jan is in very bad shape here, unless he manages to play land Emrakul, which is within the realm of possibility. I'm sure that's also what's going through Scotlip's mind at this point.
Yeah, he's carefully checking out graveyards. We have creature, land, artifact, instant, sorcery, and Planeswalker.
Yeah, that's pretty much everything you can assemble in a game of Limited. But no, just Root Evil. That must be a sideboard card being brought in. We'll take down the Lupine prototype and allow him to investigate. Or root out, rather.
So it looks like it might be that Scott Lipp is considering sacrificing the Lupin prototype to the mantle here, just so that there's not the investigation from root out. He can recognise that his opponent is digging wherever possible and doesn't really want that to happen.
Yeah, so it's a nice answer to one of the threats on Scott Lipp's side of the board, but well, there's still plenty of power going to come his way. And now also, wow, there's suddenly Delirium, which means that we will have a transformation.
Yeah, so now those Eldrazi tokens and indeed the Extricator of Malice, Extricator of Flesh, has got Vigilance. So 2 of these Eldrazi coming in with Vigilance, the other 2 creatures just regular
Yeah,
style. And
it's
there's the
13.
handshake.
It's 13 on this turn, fitting for an Emrakul deck. And Jan actually didn't even have Emrakul in hand. He did have Rise from the grave, but congratulations to Scott Lipp, champion of Grand Prix
Yeah,
Sydney.
we see a number of his teammates from Team East West Bowl coming across to congratulate him. Seth Manfield had actually been watching the match kind of on our monitors just so he could see everything that was going on, and I'm sure that he will be one of the many East West Bowl players keen to congratulate Scott Lipp, who has just put in a fantastic performance. He finished top of the Swiss to make it into this top 8 and was able to parlay that with his pretty sort of straightforward fighty green-white deck and got there, able to win the entire shebang here in Sydney. And what a great start to his trip to Sydney. That's the end of what we've got coming on from here. We will hopefully be able to get an interview with him with BDM, but Tim Willoughby and Frank Karsten, we will pass things over so that we can get that conversation soon enough.
Yeah, but what an exciting